With the increase in mass school shootings and since the tragic Florida school shootings that killed 17, we have seen many protests and much talk about gun control and better security. But what is actually causing the increase in mass shootings? Joining me now via Skype to discuss this is Jim Warner Wallace. He's a cold case homicide detective and best-selling author of Cold Case Christianity. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, Jim, it used to be incredibly rare to hear of a mass school shooting, but there seems to be a lot more of them over the last 20 years or so. You have some very interesting thoughts on why this is, and you can kind of relate it back to the days when you were, what, a patrol officer?
Yeah, I think all of us who work in this field, we're looking for changes. What has shifted? So, for example, if we were to see an increase in robberies in our city or an increase in auto thefts in one portion of our city, it hasn't been occurring for years, and now suddenly we have this burst of activity. We're going to ask ourselves, what has changed in the neighborhood? What has changed about our city that would account for this increase in auto thefts? Well, the same thing I think happens here. We can attribute auto thefts to a lot of different things, or in this case, school shootings to a lot of different things. But the real question is, what has shifted? What has changed in culture that might now account for a rise in mass school shootings?
Now, you also use a lot of social media. A lot of people use social media nowadays. It's quite prominent, especially in young people's lives. Are young people more influenced by social media than any other generation?
Yeah, I actually think there are four shifts, four changes that have occurred in culture that can contribute to this increase in shootings. And the first one I would say is the increase in the use of this invention of social media. If you go back 25 years, we're going to see a lot less in terms of school shootings. We're also not going to have any social media. This is not the only factor, but I think it's an important factor. Look at it this way. When you and I were growing up, I'm older than you, I can see, but assuming we're close to the same age. When we grew up, if we were bullied in school, we would go home at the end of the day. And the bully would not be in our presence, and the bullying would at least stop. We had a safe place. But with the advent of social media, bullies are always with us. They're as near as the little glowing rectangle at the end of your arm called your cell phone, your smartphone. So now we bring the bully home with us. And if you look at all of the school shooters, they will almost all attest to the fact that they have in some way either been bullied or ostracized. And now that ostracization, that being separated from or an outcast view they have of themselves, is amplified by social media. I think it is one small part of this shift in culture.
So how consistent would you say that is, Jim, with a pattern of school shooters being angry about the ostracization and maybe being bullied, like you said?
Yeah, I think it is an important factor because let's face it, you will say something to somebody standing in front of you, but you'll say a lot more when that person's a distance is removed from you. What social media does is it allows us the safety, quote unquote, to say and do things we really otherwise wouldn't say or do. And I think what that's done is it's just taken hostility, bullying in essence, and it's amplified it. It's put it on steroids in essence, because I think bullies can be much more of a bully because of social media. And again, that's what's happening here is that you see a lot more of the folks who are responsible for these crimes will at some point, someone's going to say, well, yeah, it's true that he was mistreated. It's true that no one liked him. We kind of separated him from us. And so that form of separation is just amplified by social media.
Now, you make a very interesting observation that society now has an increased dependency on prescription medication. How does that really tie in with the school shootings?
Well, look, I'm not against the use of medication. In fact, my son is an anesthesiologist, so and lots of parents have used the kind of mood-altering medication for ADD and other things that have helped them raise their kids. What I would suggest, though, is that as we have increased our use of this kind of mood-altering medication, we sometimes have relinquished our old responsibilities to train up our kids, to discipline our kids, to deal one-on-one with our kids. We've kind of medicated the problem away before we've ever taught them the coping skills to manage through tough situations. And nearly every one of these school shooters, when you go back and look at their past medication record, has either been using these kinds of drugs or has just recently come off these kinds of drugs. Now, again, I'm not suggesting the drugs are specifically the direct cause, but if we are going to relinquish our parenting responsibilities and replace them with this medication process, we probably are making a mistake as a culture.
So let's talk about that, spending quality one-on-one time with our children as parents. How important of a role is that, especially when it comes to kids who are being bullied?
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge. And as a matter of fact, there's a recent PBS special called Medicating Kids, in which one of the doctors says that he sees this increase in culture, this tendency to say, look, it's not easy to discipline your kids. It's not. It's not easy to have to get in there and try to use behavioral modification rather than just treat the brain. What you're really saying here is that, from our Christian worldview, is that we would say we are both brains and minds. We have two of these. We're not just brains that can be medicated with drugs. We have minds that can be changed by thinking through issues. And teaching our kids to think through those issues is going to require us to be engaged in ideas with our kids. And that's not easy. It takes time. And I get it. Let's face it. In our country, you know that most of our two-income families. And to carve this kind of time to have the kind of interaction that's necessary to make this a reality, it may be difficult.
You know, I do find it a little disconcerting that disciplining a child is often looked down upon as something that could maybe cause negative behavior in a child when they get older.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to the third shift that I see, right? We talked about social media. We talked about the increase in use of mood-altering drugs. But really, it's the collapse of the traditional two-parent family households that have a huge role in this. Let me give you an example. I worked gangs for years in South Central Los Angeles before I became a detective. And what I saw in the different groups I was working with, who were very different. I had white skinhead gangs that I was working. I had African-American gangs that I was working in the north end of our city, multi-generational Hispanic gangs on one side of our city. We even had a group of Korean gangsters on the west side of town. And in all those different groups, think about it, they're very different ethnically. They're very different racially, different socially. They had nothing in common, really, except for one disturbing truth. Every one of those kids, those young men, suffered from lack of dad. And it looked different depending on group. Sometimes they never knew who their dad was. Sometimes dad was locked up or in jail. Sometimes dad was just a complete alcoholic who never engaged his kids. Sometimes dad was a workaholic who had come into the country from, say, from Korea, had never really learned even to speak English, and was spending 90 hours a week at work. Whatever the cause, whatever it causes lack of dad, it has an important outcome in behaviors. It's that time that's spent with kids teaching boys how to be men.
You know, I was a big brother through Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Canada for many years before I became a parent myself. Then my kids took up all my time. But, you know, a lot of those young men, obviously, you know, the father passed away or maybe the dad moved on, but they were begging and then yearning for that male fatherly influence, a role model in their lives. So, you know, maybe we should get some nonprofit agencies more involved with some of these troubled youth. What do you think?
Well, I can tell you that, again, anytime you look at a cause, a set of shifts in culture that cause a certain spike in a crime rate, it's always a collection of factors, right? So any one of these things is not going to solve the problem. But when we look at the puzzle and put it together on several levels, we can begin to address the problem. And it turns out that fourth thing we talk about and the shifts that have occurred really is what answers this. And you're right. Your desire to serve as a big brother comes from an idea that it's not all about you, that you could do something for somebody else. That really is inherent to a Christian worldview, if you think about it. And so a Christian worldview has a lot to say about bullying and how we ought not bully. It has a lot to say about how we should discipline our kids and raise our kids. It has a lot to say about how we should parent in the context of a natural traditional marriage. These are things that the worldview has to. Now, by the way, if we start to lose our Christian worldview, don't be surprised that we'll lose our footing in those other three areas.
I know the Bibles were taken out of the schools a long time ago. Now, you believe there was a shift in our moral foundations, that the old-fashioned Christian values are not really valued anymore and practiced like they once were, especially in the household and at school.
Yeah, absolutely. In our country, we're seeing about a 1% decrease in those who would self-identify as Christians every year. And of course, if you're not even going to identify as a Christian, the odds of you reading the very scripture that addresses these other issues is not going to be good. There'll be a 1% decrease in anyone who's actually reading the scripture. So what's happening is we no longer are even familiar with the one worldview that would give us a footing for the other issues. So you're absolutely right. We have to, and that's what's so hard, right? I mean, I wish I could just come in and say we can fix that one problem, check the box, we're done. What it's going to require us to do instead is to rethink our worldview, to embrace something that we have a tendency to want to let go of. When we say we're conservative in this area, we're not saying we're a part of a political party. We're saying we want to conserve something ancient that we think has value. It is the Christian worldview as taught in Scripture.
Now, is the increase in violence and immoral behavior on television and with feature films, as well maybe in video games, contributed to real-life violence? Should they be held accountable, some of the Hollywood producers and the game developers?
Yeah, and I go back and forth. I debate even in my own mind on this issue because I'm not so sure that it's a cause as much as it might be a reflection. In other words, I don't know how much all the tests we've seen, all the studies we've seen are rather neutral on this issue, but I do know this. It shouldn't surprise us that as we walk away from a Christian worldview, if a more aggressive, hostile, there's a void that's being left by the Christian worldview being removed. It will be filled with something else. Don't think that it won't be filled. It will. We will seek something transcendent, and our behaviors will change because we've now moved from that other worldview. So I'm not quite sure if movies are contributing or simply reflecting our new state of mind. That's why I say it's a return to Christian worldview that's at the key to solving this problem.
So Jim, what can we do as parents that maybe, or society, to swing the pendulum the other way? Maybe monitor what our kids are watching, engage more in their lives, especially on social media?
Yeah, I think we have to learn how to answer two questions, not just, Mom, what do you believe as a Christian? But second one, Mom or Dad, why do you believe that as a Christian? We have to be in a position, because when young people leave the faith, they will almost unanimously say that one of the biggest reasons they left was intellectual discontent. They don't believe it's true anymore. They don't believe that you can answer those kinds of big questions. They think that the secular naturalistic worldviews have all the answers. We as Christian parents have to be able to answer our kids' questions. This idea of Christian apologetics, you have to be the best Christian apologist that your kid will ever engage, both from how you live your life as a Christian and to being able to answer the questions that are going to be raised against Christianity.
So let me ask you something. As a former detective, what advice would you give to the authorities who are having to deal with a lot of these issues today?
Well, I can tell you that here in our country, we will often see that, wow, this young man was on the radar of law enforcement long before he ever committed this crime. And there is the problem, right? Because you may be on our radar, but we cannot step in and become mom and dad. We cannot step in and really address those four issues we just talked about. I mean, law enforcement officials cannot do that. It turns out that parents and a commitment to parenting, that could be a solution. But the problem is going to be that we as in law enforcement, all we can really do is react to the crime that's already occurred. We are far less capable of interceding beforehand and actually solving problems before they occur. So I think what we can do, though, is we can make people aware of the fact that these are the causal factors. And if they see that these are the causal factors, maybe they'll be inclined to take them on themselves. And again, we're not going to be able to do it for them. Any more than you can raise your kids spiritually and trust that your pastors are doing that for you. No, we as mom and dad have to do that. Well, unfortunately, we're at the root of solving this problem as well.
J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective and best-selling author. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Have a great night.